The night wind carried a lonely hush across Hunter's Pass as the quiet cowboy Eli Mercer rode toward home, the moon slicing the dark sky like a silver blade. It was a stillness he was used to, a solitude he'd carved out for himself in this rugged land. But tonight, something was different. Ahead, he spotted a single lantern, its flame trembling in the breeze near a skeletal cottonwood tree. A woman knelt beside it, her hands clutching a small travel bag as if it were the last piece of her life. Dust clung to the hem of her dress, and fear shimmered in her eyes every time she cast a nervous glance over her shoulder. Eli slowed his horse, his instincts kicking in. He watched her carefully, sensing a danger that lingered in the cold air, a tension that didn't belong to the open desert. She finally noticed him, a sharp gasp escaping her lips. Her breath caught, her expression a mix of terror and desperate hope. He couldn't tell if she saw him as a threat or a savior. Her hands trembled, a clear sign she'd been running, and running hard. He dismounted slowly, letting his boots sink quietly into the dirt, not wanting to spook her further. "Ma'am," he said, his voice soft, barely rising above the wind. "You look like you've outrun a storm." She struggled to find her voice, as if her fear still held her throat in a vice. "I didn't know where else to go," she whispered, the words barely audible. He saw the exhaustion settle deep in her shoulders, the weight of something unspoken pressing her down. Just then, the wind carried a distant echo across the ridge, a sound so faint it was almost imaginary, but deeply unsettling. Eli's gaze swept the darkness behind her, scanning the vast, empty desert. Something was wrong. "You're safe now, ma'am," he said gently, trying to offer a reassurance he wasn't sure he could deliver. She flinched when he reached out to help her up, his touch revealing a faint, ugly bruise just below the cuff of her sleeve. Eli said nothing, but a quiet anger tightened his jaw. He lifted her onto his horse with careful hands, treating her as if she were made of glass. She gripped the saddle horn with a shaking hand, the cold wind biting through her thin dress. Eli guided his horse toward his cabin, a small refuge hidden between two sheer cliffs where the night rarely seemed to reach. The ride was silent, broken only by the mournful whistle of the wind through the canyon. He could feel her breath tremble with every glance she cast back into the oppressive darkness. Eli kept his ears open, alert, searching for any sound that didn't belong to the night. His cabin finally came into view, its faint glow a promise of warmth in the cold. It was a place carved out of loneliness, but tonight, it would have to be a sanctuary. He helped her inside, lighting a lantern that filled the simple wooden room with a warm, golden light. He handed her a thick wool blanket, and she wrapped it around her shoulders, her body still trembling. Her eyes moved across the small, sparse space, a simple cot, a stone fireplace, a sturdy table, as if she'd forgotten what safety felt like. "You live alone?" she asked quietly, her voice still fragile. "Been that way for a while," Eli replied, his tone even. A flicker of guilt crossed her face. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she said. "I just I had nowhere left to run." "You're not trouble," he said firmly, stoking the fire until flames licked at the logs, chasing the chill from the cabin. For the first time since he found her, she seemed to take a full, steady breath, but the peace was fleeting. "There are men looking for me," she whispered, her voice cracking with renewed fear. Eli froze, turning from the fire to watch her closely. "Who?" "They're from Carson Ridge," she said, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames. "They think I took something important." She took a shaky breath, gathering her courage. "I saw something I shouldn't have, up at the old silver mine, and now they want me gone." "For good." Eli listened without interrupting, letting her tell her story at her own pace. Her words hung in the air, heavy and dangerous. Outside, the wind shifted, slamming against the cabin walls with a sudden, violent gust. It was followed by a faint thud from outside, a sound too dull and heavy to be a falling branch. Claire gasped, clutching the blanket tighter around her. Eli moved silently toward the window, his body tensed. Another thud hit the wall, this one slower, more deliberate. The lantern flame wavered, as if it, too, felt the encroaching danger. With quiet, fluid motion, Eli reached for the rifle leaning against the table. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm but firm, a command that left no room for argument. Claire backed away from the door, raw fear returning to her eyes, erasing the brief moment of peace. The world outside grew unnervingly still. The wind died down, and the silence that filled the room was thick and suffocating, like a held breath. Claire whispered, her voice barely a thread of sound, "They found me." Eli steadied his stance, the cool wood of the rifle stock firm in his hand. He knew the words he'd spoken earlier, "You're safe now," were only half true. He had wanted her to feel safe, to find a moment of peace. But safety, out here, wasn't something you could promise. It was something you had to fight for, tooth and nail. The wind pushed against the cabin one last time, and this time, it carried the faintest echo of footsteps crunching on gravel. Eli exhaled slowly, preparing himself for what was to come. The night wasn't done with them yet, and whoever stood just outside that door was determined not to leave quietly. This was no longer just his home, it was a fortress, and he would defend it. The cabin held its breath, and so did Eli. He gripped the rifle, its cold weight a familiar counterpoint to the thrumming silence of the night. Across the small room, Claire stood near the far wall, clutching a rough wool blanket like it was the last piece of comfort left in the world. Her knuckles were white, her eyes fixed on the darkness outside the single window. Then, a sound, a soft shuffle moving past the glass, slow and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of a forest creature scurrying about its nightly business. This was measured, a sound made by someone who wanted them to hear it, a declaration of presence. Eli's eyes narrowed. He was a man who could read the language of the wilderness, and this sound was a warning, a sentence written in the dust and shadow. Claire pressed a hand to her mouth, stifling a gasp. Her tears, held at bay for hours, began to well up as a fresh wave of fear washed over her. Eli saw her distress and lifted his free hand slightly, a simple, clear signal, "Stay quiet." The lantern on the table flickered, its amber glow trembling along the rough-hewn walls, stretching their shadows into long, uneasy shapes that danced like specters. Another noise scraped gently against the outer boards. It was too controlled, too precise to be an animal. It was the sound of a tool, or perhaps a boot heel, testing the cabin's defenses. Eli took a slow, deep breath, steadying his hands, steadying his nerves. He moved toward the window, but kept to the side. A seasoned hunter avoiding the open line of sight, he wouldn't make it easy for them. Claire's voice was a whisper, so soft it barely carried across the small space. "What do they want?" Eli glanced back at her, his own voice low and steady, a rock in the churning sea of her fear. "Answers. Maybe just intimidation. They won't rush in yet. They're feeling us out." As if on cue, the wind picked up, pushing a fine layer of dust against the cabin. The sound rose and fell like a whispering crowd, murmuring threats just beyond their hearing. The isolation of the cabin, once a comfort, now felt like a trap. Drawn by a primal need for safety, Claire walked closer to him, her fear a tangible thing in the dim light. Her eyes, wide and luminous, reflected the flickering flame, but also a deeper terror, the look of someone who had been running for far too long. Eli made a decision. He rested the rifle gently against the table, not lowering his guard, but choosing a posture of calm over one of open aggression. He reached for the lantern, turning the wick down slightly to dim the light, reducing their silhouettes, making them harder targets. Claire watched his every move with a cautious trust, unsure whether his calm should be a relief or a new cause for alarm. "They're testing us," Eli murmured, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the glass. "Trying to see if you're alone." The thought sent a shaky breath through her. The idea that her presence had brought this danger to his door was a heavy burden. Eli sensed her spiraling thoughts and guided her away from the window, leading her toward the small wooden table. "Sit," he whispered, his tone gentle but firm. "Let them wonder what we're doing in here. Let them imagine." She obeyed, sinking onto the rickety chair. Her fingers, still trembling, traced the grain of the wood. As if responding to their change in tactics, the scraping outside stopped as suddenly as it had begun. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was thicker this time, heavier, charged with anticipation. Eli eased onto the chair across from her, his posture relaxed but ready. In the lantern's soft glow, he watched her, giving her a moment to collect herself. "You said you saw something," he began, his voice softening. "Something they don't want known." Claire swallowed hard, her gaze darting away to the dancing flames in the hearth. Her silence wasn't reluctance. It was the raw, paralyzing fear of saying the wrong thing, of putting the horror into words and making it real all over again. Eli leaned forward, his elbows on the table, closing the distance between them. His voice was warm but firm, a lifeline. "Whatever you saw, you're not facing it alone anymore." His words landed, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, a tiny flicker of hope sparked in her eyes. The terror didn't vanish, but it receded just enough for her to breathe. She placed her hands flat on the table, as if to ground herself, to gather her scattered strength. "At Carson Ridge," she began, her voice gaining a little more substance. "I worked at the boarding house. Men came through all the time. Ranchers, riders, drifters looking for work." Eli nodded slowly, his expression patient, encouraging her to continue at her own pace. "One night, I heard arguing downstairs. I was getting ready to lock up for the night. The voices, I recognized them, men with influence in the territory. Men who had no business meeting in secret in the dead of night." She took another shaky breath, the memory pulling her back. "I didn't mean to eavesdrop. I froze. They talked about land they wanted to claim, land that already belonged to families who'd worked it for years." Eli's jaw tightened, a subtle shift, but she saw it. He understood the gravity of what she was saying. "They planned to scare them off," she continued, the words tumbling out now. "Start fires, spread lies, run them off their homesteads, one by one, until the whole valley was theirs for the taking." The fire crackled softly in the corner, a gentle counterpoint to the harshness of her story. "I must have stepped too close to the stairs. The floorboard creaked. I made a noise. And they saw me." She lowered her head, shame coloring her voice, the misplaced guilt of a victim. "I ran. I didn't even grab my coat or my things. A friend warned me later that they were looking for me, asking questions." Her eyes, glistening with unshed tears, met his. "Now they think I stole a map they'd hidden. A map showing every homestead, every piece of land they planned to take." Eli leaned back slowly, absorbing every word, fitting the pieces together. The men outside weren't just common thugs. They were agents of a much larger, more dangerous power. He looked toward the window again, sensing the quiet, oppressive pressure of the night. These weren't men who would give up easily. "They won't stop," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Not until they find me." "And the map?" Eli studied her face, seeing the deep exhaustion, the bone-deep fear, but also a stubborn flicker of determination burning beneath it all. She had run, but she hadn't broken. "You're right," he said softly, his voice leaving no room for false hope. "They won't stop." Claire's breath hitched, the fragile hope from moments ago threatening to shatter. "But," Eli added, and his voice was as steady and unmovable as bedrock, "I won't stop either." She looked at him, startled by the raw conviction in his tone. It wasn't a boast, it was a simple statement of fact. Before she could find the words to respond, a new sound cut through the night, a soft whinny, carried on the wind from the canyon beyond the cabin. Claire stiffened instantly. Eli was on his feet in a silent, fluid motion, moving back to the window. He peered into the oppressive darkness. Down in the valley, faint shapes shifted against the landscape, barely visible, just shadows against deeper shadow. Horses, more than one. They were keeping their distance, a silent, mounted perimeter, waiting with patient, predatory intent. They were settling in for a siege. The familiar weight of responsibility settled across Eli's shoulders. This was no longer just about giving a stranger a place to rest for the night. Her fight was now his. He turned back to Claire, who watched him with wide, fearful eyes, her question unspoken. "We're leaving at first light," he said, his tone decisive. She blinked, confused. Where can we go?" "Somewhere they won't dare follow." The fire crackled again, throwing a shower of soft sparks into the air like a cloud of scattered, dying stars. Outside, the quiet shadows remained still, listening, waiting for their next move. Inside, Claire drew the blanket tighter around her shoulders, her heart racing with a mixture of terror and a strange, unfamiliar surge of resolve. Eli stood between her and the window, a quiet guardian he never meant to become, a silhouette of defiance against the encroaching darkness. The night was far from over, and the danger outside wasn't done closing in. "Thank you for joining me on this part of the journey. If you're captivated by Eli and Claire's story, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. The trail is about to get a whole lot more dangerous." The first light of dawn crept over the ridge, turning the desert gold. Eli saddled the horses with quiet efficiency, his movements sure and practiced. He checked each strap twice, his ears tuned to any sound beyond the cabin walls. Claire stepped outside, the same wool blanket from the night before wrapped around her shoulders. Her eyes were tired, shadowed with fear, but they held a new steadiness that hadn't been there before. The chill of the high desert morning carried a fragile, deceptive peace. They both knew it wouldn't last. Eli helped her mount, his hands firm yet gentle, as if he feared she might crumble under the weight of everything she was carrying. He swung onto his own horse, taking the lead as they moved into the pale, growing glow of the sunrise. The desert opened up before them, a wide, endless, and silent expanse. But Claire couldn't stop herself from glancing over her shoulder, her mind replaying the terror of the previous night, expecting to see riders thundering after them at any moment. Eli noticed her unease. "Keep your eyes forward," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Fear rides faster when you look behind too much." She tried to muster a smile, a small acknowledgement of his attempt to comfort her, but the worrying lingered in her eyes like a stubborn shadow. They rode through a ridge trail where the canyon walls grew narrow and steep, closing in around them. Eli listened intently to the steady rhythm of their horses' hooves, the soft echo of each step bouncing off the ancient stone. It was a sound that should have been calming, but today it felt like a drumbeat counting down their time. Halfway through the pass, the horses snorted nervously, their ears twitching. Claire tensed in her saddle, her knuckles white where she gripped the reins. Eli slowed them to a careful, deliberate walk, his gaze sweeping the jagged ridge line above them. A single rock tumbled from the top, a small cascade of pebbles and dust, but it was unmistakable. Someone was up there. Eli pulled Claire's reins gently, bringing her horse closer to his side. "Stay close to me," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the air. They guided the horses deeper into the canyon, where a thin mist from the morning dew rose from the ground like smoke, obscuring the path ahead. Another rock shifted above them, then another. Claire's breath caught in her throat, a small, sharp sound of panic. A silhouette stepped to the cliff's edge, a dark figure against the brightening sky, watching them with a sharp, predatory patience that sent a chill down Claire's spine. Eli didn't look up, he didn't need to. He could feel the eyes on them. "I know you're there," he called out, his voice calm and steady, betraying none of the tension coiling in his gut. Silence hung heavy in the narrow pass. The air was thick with unsaid threats. Claire's horse shivered beneath her, sensing the danger that still lingered. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice trembling. Eli was already turning his mount toward the end of the pass. They pushed forward, urging the horses into a trot as the canyon walls finally fell away, opening into a sweeping stretch of open prairie. Freedom seemed just within reach, but as soon as they reached the clearing, their hopes were shattered. 3 riders emerged from the tree line directly ahead, their horses blocking the path. Eli reacted instantly, shifting his horse slightly to shield her, a protective instinct taking over without a second thought. Dust curled around the hooves of the approaching riders. Their leader, a tall man in a long, dark duster coat with sharp, Merciless eyes raised a hand in a mock greeting. "Morning, Eli," he said, his voice smooth as polished stone but carrying a deadly edge. Claire froze. She recognized that voice. He was one of the men she'd overheard in the boarding house, the men who had murdered for a secret she now carried. Eli kept his own tone even, a mask of calm. "You don't want to do this." "Oh, I do," the man replied, a cruel smile touching his lips. Claire tightened her grip, hot tears of terror burning behind her eyes. The other two riders began to spread out, forming a loose half-circle, cutting off any chance of escape. Eli's hand hovered near the worn leather of his holster, his fingers ready, but he didn't draw, not yet. "You start a fight here," he said quietly, his voice low and dangerous, "and you'll finish it in the ground." The leader smirked, unimpressed. "You can't protect her forever." Eli's jaw tightened, a muscle twitching in his cheek. Just long enough. A tense, unbearable stillness settled over the prairie, broken only by the soft creak of leather and the heavy breathing of the horses. Claire whispered his name. "Eli, please." Her voice cracked with a desperate fear, and in that moment, something in Eli shifted. His quiet resolve hardened into unyielding steel. He guided his horse a single step forward, placing himself fully between Claire and the riders, a living shield. "You're leavin'," he said, the words a command, not a suggestion. The echo of the moment seemed to stretch then, as if time itself held its breath. Eli's voice rang out, sharp and commanding, a whip crack in the silent air. "Don't do it." For a split second, the leader hesitated, thrown off by the raw, unexpected power in Eli's tone, by the sheer intensity burning in his eyes. That single heartbeat was all Eli needed. In that moment of hesitation, the second rider, impatient and eager for violence, nudged his horse forward. The leader shot him a furious glance, his perfectly laid plan unraveling before his eyes. Eli seized the moment of confusion. He grabbed Claire's reins and pulled her horse sideways, forcing a wedge of distance between her and the threat. The riders were caught completely off balance, surprised by the sudden, decisive maneuver. Eli used their confusion to turn both their horses toward the old, dry riverbed that cut across the prairie behind them. "Hold on," he shouted to Claire. She didn't hesitate. She wrapped her arms around him, her fear and trust tangled together as she held on for dear life. The horses bolted, their hoofs pounding like thunder over the dry ground. Behind them came angry shouts, then the sharp crack of hooves as the riders gave chase. Dust rose in thick, choking clouds, swallowing the world behind them. Eli pushed the horses harder, their lungs burning, their legs straining. He guided them toward a low ridge that led to an abandoned homestead he knew from his years of riding these lands. A crumbling barn stood against the skyline like the skeleton of old memories, half collapsed, but still offering the cover they so desperately needed. They slid to a halt behind it just as the riders reached the riverbed below. Eli and Claire dismounted, pressing themselves close to the weathered wood of the barn wall. Their breaths were ragged, their hearts hammering against their ribs. They listened. The riders fanned out, their voices growing faint as they circled the area, searching for any sign of their trail. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an hour, then more minutes. Finally, fooled by the dust trail Eli had cleverly led them into, the riders gave up the chase and turned back toward town. Claire slumped against him, the tension draining out of her in a flood of tears, this time born of pure relief. Eli rested a steady hand on her shoulder, his own relief just as profound. "You're safe," he said softly, and for the first time, he believed it. The morning sun rose higher, painting the sky in warm golds and soft pinks, a new day dawning. Claire turned to him, her emotions finally breaking loose in her voice. "Why did you help me? You didn't have to risk all this for a stranger." Eli looked out toward the open land, the shadows of his own past finally lifting from his face in the morning light. "Because someone once helped me when I didn't deserve it," he murmured, his voice quiet with memory. "Figured it was time I passed that on." She wiped the tears from her eyes, studying his face with something deeper than just gratitude. "What now?" she whispered, Eli met her gaze, his eyes steady, honest, and full of a quiet promise he intended to keep. "Now," he said, a small, genuine smile finally reaching his lips. "We start over, somewhere new, somewhere peaceful." The wind carried the clean, fresh scent of morning sage as they mounted their horses once again. Together, they rode toward the horizon, leaving the fear and the violence behind them, carrying a fragile but growing hope ahead. And as the prairie opened wide and welcoming before them, the quiet cowboy finally felt the weight of his own past loosen its grip on his shoulders, because, for the first time in a long, long time, he wasn't riding alone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this. See you next time.